listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to the September 17th edition of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Let's find out more about today's guest, Nate Bell.
Today on Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards. Nate Bell is an outspoken never-Trump conservative and has been politically homeless since 2016. A lifelong Republican until 2015, Nate served in the Arkansas State House of Representatives from 2011 to 2017, where he chaired the State Agencies and Government Affairs Committee, served as House Chair of the Legislative Audit Subcommittee on State Agencies, and as House Co-Chair of the Joint Committee on Constitutional Amendments. After 3 terms in office, Nate chose not to seek re-election, but he remains politically active and stirs up good trouble. He and his wife of 34 years live sustainably and off-grid on 225 wilderness acres in a unique home they built themselves. They have 2 grown daughters and 1 grandson. Tune in for a conversation with Nate Bell that will nudge you to think deeper about your political choices. Here's your host, Melvin E. Edwards.
Nate, thanks for joining me today.
Well, good morning, Melvin. It's my pleasure.
So how's the weather up there in Arkansas?
Perfect. We actually had our first windows open night last night, got down to about 55, and I'm sitting here with the windows open in the house with a high of 76 called for and no humidity. So one of those perfect fall days.
Well, it's not quite that cool here in South Texas, but it's cooler than it was about 10 days ago when we had 108 degrees. I think it's only 94 today.
I was in Houston about 2 weeks ago, and it was definitely sticky and hot.
It's sticky and hot all the time in Houston. That's my hometown. So you live off the grid. So how do you have internet access?
Well, being off the grid doesn't necessarily mean you're not connected. I actually have Starlink for my internet. It's all, from satellite. We just don't have pipes or wires connecting us to anywhere else. So we're self-sufficient here.
Okay. So you do realize that without standard utilities, you're playing right into that stereotype that most of the country has about Arkansas, right?
Well, yeah, except I have lights, I have air conditioning, I have, I have all the things that the stereotype doesn't include. I actually still have my teeth too.
I think we shared this online at some point that I went to college in Arkansas, so I got to experience a little bit of Arkansas life back in the 80s.
Which school did you go to?
I went to John Brown University up in the northwest
corner. Yeah, that's right. You did tell me that. And I live about 20 miles from John Brown. So.
Okay. I haven't been up there since 1989. I need to go back to a reunion at some point, I guess.
You won't recognize the area. The campus doesn't look a lot different, but the area has completely changed.
Okay. I really need to go back and visit. So as I mentioned, you live off the grid, and I'm wondering if that's because it's harder for your former colleagues to track you down and harass you. Is that why?
No, I maintain a pretty public profile, throughout most of my life. But this has been a hobby of mine, I guess, since I was a child. I've always been interested in sustainable living and in particular the energy aspects of it. I've worked professionally in and around energy, both as a legislator and, in the solar business and tax credit exchange business.
All right. So now that you're not an elected official, what do you do officially to keep yourself occupied these days?
I don't have much free time. Professionally, I am the managing director of acquisitions for a company, Atlanta-based company, Armagh Capital, where I purchase I enter into brokerage agreements with various people who generate tax credits, particularly transferable tax credits, and we monetize those credits. So I primarily work with renewable energy developers, whether it's hydrogen, hydro, wind, solar. Probably the bulk of our business is solar, but and we do a lot of business in Texas, as you can imagine. Interesting aside, you may not know that Texas is actually leading the nation in renewable energy development currently. The market deregulation that you did down there 20 odd years ago has made it a very attractive place to locate renewables, and it's having a you may have noticed fewer brownouts recently. You all are rapidly becoming a energy surplus region in the electricity arena, in addition to your petrochemical surplus. So moving in the right direction.
Yeah, that is good to hear. I worked in the legislature about 20 years ago when that was being debated. So I got to see some of the behind the scenes stuff. And I have my solar panels on my house, so cut down on my utility bills this summer. I was definitely appreciative of that when the temperature got up to 108. So we're heading in the right direction. How did you get involved in politics? And what was the journey that eventually led you out of politics?
Well, politics was my dad and my sport as a kid growing up. We didn't really follow sports much, but we followed elections and politics, political history. And I first got involved as a volunteer for Reagan Bush 84, just as a kid, and, knocked doors and actually worked as a poll watcher on election day and all the various things during that campaign. Really got bit by the bug. I just loved it and liked being around the people who were making a difference in the community. And so that led to a lifelong interest. In my 30s, I really had relocated back to Arkansas, which was my family's original home, and was disturbed by the quality of people who were in office. Frankly, I didn't feel like they were doing a great job, and I just reached the point that I said, I can't do any worse a job than they are. I think I should run. And so I actually ran for constable for my township, and beat a long-term incumbent, and served 4 terms, I believe, as constable, and had a number of people approach me and say, you should run for state representative. And I gave that some consideration. My area had never elected a Republican to any office above township level, and I'd run as a Republican for constable and won. And I just decided that I would pull the trigger on it, and we won that first race, but with about a 20% margin, won convincingly. And then I promised my family and community that I'd serve 3 terms and leave office. And I won each of my 2 races after that by in excess of 30 points, one of them by almost 35 points. And but did not seek re-election for a 4th term, and returned to the private sector, went back to farming full time at that time, and have subsequently, could develop the solar business, and then moved on into the marketing with the tax credits.
Okay, you talked about politics being your brand of sports. What did it feel like the first time you won election for your representative seat in the Arkansas House?
Well, it was a historic moment because, again, no Republican had ever won. Everybody told me that there was no way I was going to win that race. It was an impossible hurdle, and it was very satisfying. And I think everybody, when they're first elected to any office with influence, even though a state rep has very minimal influence, you feel like you can go change the world. And so, I went into the legislature with a much more hopeful outlook than I had when I left. I think that's the best way I could phrase it. I think 4 or 5 of my colleagues went to prison during the time that I served in the legislature. The corruption was rampant in the legislature, both R and D. To get anything good done would have required entering the corruption. And So I focused primarily on the stuff that a lot of people don't pay attention to, the nuts and bolts behind the scenes, changing how the machine works. I spent a lot of time on election law, cleaning up. Arkansas had some really bad issues with election and election related corruption. And Secretary of State was a good friend, and he and I worked closely together on looking at how we could improve our election laws. And really, I believe today it's fair to say that Arkansas has the safest, cleanest run, most secure elections in the country. And I'm proud of that. So we got a lot of good stuff done in that arena. I became chair of the state agencies committee, and so again, working on those nuts and bolts things. Also served as chair of the House chair of the Joint Committee on Constitutional Amendments. So we did a lot of work on, one of the things that I really believe is that our term limits that we had in Arkansas were too short. I didn't want to stay in office longer, but I believe we needed more time for people to begin to understand. And so I helped put together a constitutional amendment that subsequently passed to extend the term limits from 6 years out to 16 years. And, that's definitely had a stabilizing influence on state government. So, looking back on it in retrospect, while I didn't change the world, I got some good things accomplished that I think make our state a better place to live, work, and raise a family. And that's why I ran. So I'm happy about that. But at the same time, there were a lot of frustrating moments. And, one of the big ones that I took on in my last term was Arkansas had a joint state holiday for Robert E. Lee and Dr. Martin Luther King. And I felt like it was just unconscionable that we continued as one of two states to have that, and filed a bill to split those. Not to completely do away with the Lee holiday, but to just say, look, we're not going to have them on the same day. Move Lee's to the fall, and let's do it that way. And I encountered, I called it the Confederate Army. They showed up at my committee I chaired the committee that the bill would come through, and so I could hear the bill when I wanted to hear it. And so but those guys would show up every day, and there was intimidation. I had threats to burn my home. I actually moved most of my family heirlooms and valuables out of my home during that legislative session because of the threats, because, obviously couldn't be at home because I had to be at the Capitol. So that was an interesting experience. Had strong opposition both from Republicans and Democrats on that bill, and ultimately was never able to get it out of committee. A committee that was 3/4 Republican. Very frustrated by that. Governor Hutchinson, to his great credit, promised me that he would make it a priority in his next in the next legislative session, that he would make it his number one priority, and he did subsequently get that done in the next term. I wasn't there to be a part of that, but I do consider that part of my legacy as well, just being able to get that process started and get his commitment to make it happen.
All right. So if you were running right now against Donald Trump for a state office there in Arkansas, how would you campaign against him?
Integrity. A man's word is his bond, and Donald Trump is a man who can't keep his word. And so, look, I've run a number of campaigns for local office, and one of the things that I think has been missed in dealing with Donald Trump from the very beginning is that he should have been taken on about the fact that he doesn't pay his bills. And I think how many times he stiffed the little guy and stiffed the small contractor. And I would immediately go to that and start talking about how the fact that this is a guy who you just can't trust. You can't trust him to follow through on his contracts. You can't trust him, and work on trust, because I think there are two things that people vote for, and I believe this is true at every level of politics. They vote for people they like, and they vote for people they trust. And the reality is that the reason Donald Trump came along and became trusted is partially because of the image that he created of himself in The Apprentice, which I think had a tremendous impact. People felt like he was trustworthy for some reason, and it's a lot of it is it's an image, um, but he also came across more likable to the common person than a lot of what they'd seen from politicians. And it's, obviously, for those of us who took the time to research Donald Trump, I've been very vocal about it. He's been bought and paid for by the Russians since the 90s. And, he's nothing but a Russian stooge and has been from the beginning. And it's extremely frustrating to me, particularly with what's come out in the last few days with the indictment, directly implicating the Russian government spending millions buying off right-wing influencers and all the pieces associated with that. So I think, but you can't successfully attack after someone has defined themselves. And that's one of the problems that's existed around Donald Trump from the beginning. He largely was defined in the minds of Americans by his TV show. And because of that, he was very difficult to attack. And I think his Republican opponents in the Republican primary in 2015 and 2016 took him on incorrectly. They all felt like that he would fade away. And so they all just wanted to be the one to survive and benefit from his base. And because of that, none of them directly challenged him until it was too late. And by the time that they directly challenged him, they had let him define too large a percentage of the base as his own.
All right. So speaking of Trump, and sort of a different type of an issue, one of the issues that's near and dear to you is solar power and renewable energy. And Trump has been publicly opposed to any kind of renewable energy sources. So which one of you has the more conservative position on this issue?
Oh, I think there's no question that I do, and I'll tell you specifically why. There is no purer form of energy independence than to live independent of the grid, to live independent of oil companies, to live independent of OPEC and those nations and people that hate you. And the reality is that the fastest, simplest way to live energy independent is solar power. And that's just a reality. And so I think, but beyond that, it's a national security issue. We don't need to be spending our dollars with the Russians, with the Venezuelans, with all the nations around the world who hate us. The Saudis, all of these folks who finance terrorism. We indirectly finance them with our petroleum dollars when we're buying offshore oil. And the reality is that we have the ability within our own country to generate and produce all of our own energy. And that's, I'm an all sources guy. I'm not one of these folks who believes that we shouldn't have oil, or that we shouldn't use coal, or that we shouldn't use nuclear. What I think is that we need to embrace all sources of energy. But right now, the reality is, even unsubsidized, even completely unsubsidized, solar power is by far the cheapest form of electrical generation in this country, and it's going to do nothing but get cheaper. Right now, for instance, as much as I love nuclear power, and I've been a long advocate for nuclear power, solar costs about 1/6 of what nuclear power does to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity. Even if you add battery storage, it still's about half. And, that's right there with coal. And so you just have to, the other thing that's really important to keep in mind when you look at solar is it tends to peak when demand on the grid is at its highest. And so it naturally follows the curve that we humans put on electrical demand. And so those hot afternoons is when you tend to have the most solar power available. And that's, it just, it alone is not, there is no panacea. But if you bring a good mix of renewables in and have a diverse range of places that your energy comes from, you get a better result. As I mentioned to you earlier, or maybe even before we went on the air, just last week, Texas hit 86 gigawatt demand, which is the highest ever. and you didn't have a brownout. The entire state stayed on and functional because in the last year you've had 21 gigawatts of solar come online. And the reality is you were having all the brownouts and all the other problems at about 60 gigawatts of load. And so you went 25% higher load without having the problems. And that's largely because of solar power.
Okay, so I feel like I'm part of the solution now instead of part of the problem.
There you go. There you go.
So you built your own home there in Arkansas on your property using your own resources there that are on the property. So what was that process like for you and your family?
Well, we've lived a bit unconventionally for a number of years because my wife and I both have worked in and around government and in various professional roles. So we've maintained two residences. In fact, this June is the first time that we've not had a second residence. So my wife had, we had a home in Little Rock and at the Capitol. And so we're about 200 miles from there, 170 miles, I guess, here. And she stayed there during the week, worked there during the week. I stayed up here at our property and worked on building this home. I lived in a 12 by 12 wall tent for most of a year, and during the process of building the home. And this property had literally had nothing on it when we started. It had not been used for most of a century, other than for some hunting and various recreational uses. Had no roads, etc. But that's one of the beauties of it. That's one of the reasons we didn't want to put a power line across it. Our home sits at the very back of the property. Our driveway is 1 4/10 miles long, and so we didn't want to scar it up by putting a big power line scar across it to get power back here. But yeah, I sawed all the lumber for the home on our own little band mill from trees that I cleared, primarily putting the road in, and then proceeded. I have a background as a builder, so it wasn't outside my skill set, but I designed it all, engineered all of the systems, and then my wife and I and our youngest daughter, she helped us tremendously. We built this thing.
How long did it take you?
Well, these kind of things are never done. If you look behind me, I'm sitting on a balcony and there's no railing behind me. I kind of like it that way, but they still yell at me. So there's a few unfinished things like that need to be tied up, and we're about 4 years into it. But the core construction of the house, getting it where all the systems were running and it was a functional home, took about 1.5 years.
Okay. All right. That sounds awesome. All right. So let's get back to current politics here for a second. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump a lot more than I would prefer, but it's hard to ignore such a large slice of the electorate. So with that being said, do you think Trump has killed the GOP, or do you think it's primed for a comeback in November?
Trump has killed the GOP. I've actually been saying that since mid-2016 when he was formally nominated. I think GOP signed its own death warrant at that point. They just don't recognize it yet. And we're actually seeing that right here in Arkansas. We're seeing it all around the country, but just night before last, the Saline County Republican Party meeting turned into a fist fight and a brawl that resulted in the police showing up. And the reality is, I get calls from elected officials and party people on a daily basis. Many of them have remained my friends. And, they're like, Nate, what can we do about this? And I'm like, you guys, you can't. The cat's out of the bag. The problem is good people stopped coming to your meetings and stopped participating in your party because of this. And the fact when you all wouldn't take a stand and repudiate it. And so good people are not going to come back to that. And that's the reality. So what you have now is you just have this Trumpian, the rules don't matter, power at any cost mentality that's driving everything. And that there's no way you can bring order to that kind of chaos because these are people who don't respect the order. They don't respect the rule of law. rules are intended to be broken, and that's just the way they look at the world. So the party cannot survive that. And I don't see any way for the few remaining, look, there aren't very many party officials left who are principled and will take a stand. Elected officials, the few remaining are exiting: Mitt Romney, Larry Hogan, some of those folks who have taken stands, Governor Hutchinson here in Arkansas. They've paid a dear price for it politically, and there's no path forward for them to be leaders in the party. A repudiation of Donald Trump is not going to end Trumpism within the Republican Party. It's going to end Trumpism as something that's politically viable. But I don't think the party has a path forward. That's my position. That's why I've strongly advocated for a new center-right party since 2016.
All right. Actually, I think that's how you and I connected online through that type of an effort. So if the Republican Party is that much in shambles right now, how come Southern Democrats keep losing key elections?
Well, I actually have spoken extensively on this and written extensively on it. I occasionally write for our left-wing rag here in Arkansas, the Arkansas Times, and I wrote a piece earlier this year on why Democrats lose elections, and it's really quite simple. The National Democrat Party is just too far left for the average Southerner to support, and in particular on social issues. Southern rural people, and in these predominantly rural states, that's the bulk of your voters, are not going to embrace the far left cultural ideas of the Democratic Party. And because of that, Southern Democrats, when they got so marginalized, when these states swung hard red, like many of them did in the 80s and 90s and Arkansas 2000s, the only Democrats who remained in power were the ones in the deeply blue areas. So, most of these states don't have purple districts. They're either hard red or hard blue. And some of that gerrymandering contributes some to that. I believe primaries contribute even more to it, and that's a whole another discussion. But just in that process, we've wound up with people who just don't get it. And I don't know. I don't know that there's a way for it to get better without that entire ecosystem to just collapse.
All right. So with the younger generation, Gen Z, how did the GOP lose that group?
Well, I think that's probably best expressed, and I don't think either of them would care. I have two daughters who are both in their 30s. They're both professional women, both educated with terminal degrees in their professional fields, and lifelong Republican activists, conservative. Both of them strongly pro-life, and both of them have told me they'll never vote for another Republican. And for me, myself, this is the first election of my lifetime. I'm 55 that I won't vote for a single Republican. There are many Democrats that I won't vote for, but I'm not going to vote for any Republicans simply because they've lacked the courage to step up and call this out for what it is.
All right. Without getting too deeply into my own personal political views, I'll just say I agree with everything you just said. That's been my trajectory too. Former Republican, about the same time as you, at 84. I'm a couple of years older than you. Voted for the first time in 84. Voted for Reagan, and in 2016, I also declared the Republican Party dead. I thought its decline would be much swifter than it's been. There's been a death rattle for 8 years now, and it's just getting louder the closer it is to his final breath, I believe. So, look,
foreign influence affects that, and you've had hundreds of millions of dollars pumped into the United States by Russia, in particular, to prop it up. And I'm not going to let that get swept under the rug. It's underreported. It's been known from the beginning, and that is the problem with Trumpism. It's Russian influence.
And he mocks anybody who actually brings that issue, makes it public.
He mocks it because it terrifies him.
So do you think you'll ever officially switch to the Democratic Party?
I don't see that happening. The Democrat Party's values on many things are not consistent with my own, and it's a long list, but probably near the top of that list, I'm a self-described gun nut. Their points of view on issues related to firearms are utterly and totally inconsistent with my own beliefs. I am unquestionably pro-life. Now, we can debate the political merits of rape and incest exemptions. I don't believe. I go to what Mother Teresa said, that it's a poverty to decide that a child must die so that you may live as you wish. I just generally don't view abortion as something that should be happening. And that point of view is highly not tolerated within the Democratic Party. Yeah, there's a small pro-life segment within the Democratic Party, and it's becoming more vocal. And I have some hope that they can build a beachhead there that could leave folks like me with some voice within the party. But fiscal issues are where they've just generally been completely incompatible. I believe that the most important issue facing the United States, other than the immediate threat of Trumpism, is debt and deficits. And at least for most of my life, the Republican Party gave lip service to doing something about it. Now, we can argue the practicality of it, but they've completely abandoned even giving lip service to trying to do something about it now. And so Democrats have never really advocated for what I would consider solid fiscal policy and truly limited government. One of the things that pushed me away from the Republican Party and Trumpism in particular is just the whole nanny state politics. I believe in self-reliance. I believe in individual responsibility. I believe in those things that Reagan talked about. You mentioned Reagan as well, and neither party advocates for those things today. And so the Democrats would have to change a lot before I could feel comfortable as a Democrat. And I don't really see the party moving far enough my direction for me to ever formally become a Democrat. I'm friendly with a lot of Democrats. I will vote for a few Democrats. But as a general rule, their party platform is not consistent with my values.
All right. Can Vice President Harris win this November? And whether she wins or not, will she get your support?
I think she will win. I'm not in a swing state, and so my state I think it will vote with less of a percentage for Trump than it has in the past, but it will certainly vote for Trump, and but I do expect Harris to win. I have not publicly committed to supporting Harris. I am confident that I don't want Trump to win, and I would have a much more difficult decision were I in a swing state. In fact, were I in a swing state, there's a very high likelihood I would vote for her. In a red state, there's probably a pretty good likelihood that I'll just undervote, because it really ultimately doesn't affect the outcome.
Okay, so on that same issue, and this is a little more personal not personal to you, but personal to the candidates. Why do you think so many people call Kamala Harris by her first name and Donald Trump by his last name? And that may be an odd question, but that's something I was thinking about yesterday.
No, I think it's not an odd question. It's actually one that's intriguing. I think it's a way to diminish her in many ways. I think it's a way to be disrespectful without being overtly disrespectful. And there's probably a racial element built into it as well. You and I are creatures of the South, and one of the things that I've seen for decades is sort of the way that people would throw the term boy around. It's speaking to a person of considerable influence using their first name versus their title or their last name. In the old Southern towns, we would refer to someone of substance in the community as Mr. or Mrs. X. And, that's pretty much how they were known. We didn't use first names for people of influence. And we used first names for people who were further down the social tier than ourselves. And I think there's a disrespect built into it. And I think that's predominantly what drives that.
I agree 100%. All right, so we're starting to wind down the conversation, but I do want to touch on something a little bit lighter before we wrap this up. So let's talk about something that I know you're interested in, barbecue. Since we're recording this on the weekend, so let's talk about barbecue. Tell me what you love about barbecue. Do you like barbecuing? Do you just like eating barbecue?
I love barbecue, and for the few Yankees who are watching this, grilling is not barbecuing. And so, if you putting hamburgers and hot dogs on a grill, you're not barbecuing. So barbecue is a 24-hour event that requires time, and good barbecue is low and slow. So we got to start with that. Now, I live between Memphis and Kansas City, and if you drew a line between the two and put my geographic location on it, that's about where I fall in terms of my tastes in barbecue as well. I like somewhere between those two styles. I am okay with some of the Texas style as well. But I'm more of a pork barbecue guy than I am a beef barbecue guy. I do enjoy brisket, but pork ribs are where it's at for me. And I'm enough of a barbecue snob that I'm to the point now I won't eat ribs in a restaurant because they never measure up to what I make at home. So, and I'm always disappointed. So I just generally don't order them. But good barbecue is, as I know there are a number of factors that play into it. You've got to have a good smoke ring. You've got to have good bark. You've got to have, how that rib, for me, how a rib breaks from the bone is critically important. And so, I'm always judging my own based on the break. But, about 190 degrees for about 11 to 12 hours is about what it takes to get a rib and get it right.
I love barbecuing ribs too. I barbecued ribs on Labor Day and was really satisfied with the way they turned out. But I was disappointed in my wife because I had made extra. We thought we were going to have company come over and they weren't able to make it. So I was all excited. I went to work the next day and thought, when I get home, I'm going to have some ribs. And she had eaten them. Can you believe that? That's one of those things they don't tell you about marriage when you get into it. You got to love people through even that.
You got to love them when they eat your ribs.
All right, so that's we're going to wind down this episode now. So our guest today has been former Arkansas Representative Nate Bell. So thanks for being here today, Nate. It's been interesting and a fun conversation.
I've certainly enjoyed it, and it's always nice to talk barbecue, solar, and bash Trump a little bit.
Yeah, there's lots of other issues that I wanted to talk about, but so maybe we'll have you back on again, and we'll bring up those other issues, and maybe we'll do it around the election time, and we can talk about some on the ground political stuff.
I think November and December, we're going to be having some very interesting conversations in the USA. So it would be fun to get back together,
So if you're new here, please subscribe and follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. And also please share it with a friend. I'd greatly appreciate it. That's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another great storytelling journey. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
That was Stories from Real Life. Join us again next week for another great storytelling journey. See you next time.